There are families who never have to hide their crimes. They carve their names into libraries, build hospitals, and are remembered as visionaries. But behind every statue, there are bones. Behind every marble inscription, there are bodies. Some dynasties don't just make money from addiction, they build empires on it. In the 21st century, the Sackler family became the face of modern addiction. Their company turned painkillers into a trillion-dollar plague, flooding America with opioids and calling it medicine. The world was horrified. Yet more than a century before the Sacklers, another family had already written the same script. They didn't just profit from addiction, they industrialized it. They weaponized it. They turned entire nations into customers. Their name was the Sassoons. Once they were refugees, Jewish merchants who fled Baghdad in 1832, escaping persecution and starting over in British India. Within a few decades, they would become one of the richest families on earth. Their tool wasn't steel or oil or gold, it was opium. Walk through the city of Mumbai today, and you'll still see their legacy. The David Sassoon Library, the Sassoon Dock, synagogues, schools, hospitals. Every building stands as a monument to generosity, and every one of them was built with money made from human suffering. While the British Empire was turning India into a drug factory, the Sassoons positioned themselves at the center of the trade. They didn't just sell opium. They owned the warehouses, financed the farmers, built the ships, and insured the cargo. They became the invisible hand behind the world's largest narcotics network, and they did it all legally. Because this wasn't crime. This was policy. The British Empire was drowning in debt, paying silver to China for tea and silk. So it found a solution. Grow opium in India, ship it to China, and make the Chinese pay in silver. The trade deficit vanished, the empire thrived, and the Sassoons became its bankers of addiction. When China resisted, when an official named Lin Zexu seized and destroyed 1,400 tons of opium, the British didn't apologize. They sent gunboats. The Opium Wars began, fought not for freedom or morality, but to protect drug profits. And when the smoke cleared, the Sassoons were rewarded with titles, land, and glory. In the eyes of the empire, they weren't criminals. They were pillars of civilization. That's the paradox. History remembers the architecture, not the ashes beneath it. The same system that created the Sassoons still exists. Different names, different drugs, same pattern. Corporations push dependency, call it treatment, launder guilt through philanthropy, and wait for time to turn their crimes into legacy. This is not just a story about the past. It's a pattern that never died. If you can recognize it, you'll see it everywhere, in your medicine cabinet, in the headlines, in the billion-dollar charities built on quiet suffering. History doesn't repeat. It whispers, and right now, it's whispering again. In the early 19th century, the world's richest empire had an addiction of its own. Britain was hooked on tea. Every aristocrat, every merchant, every factory worker, tea had become not a luxury but a necessity. The problem was that all of it came from China, and China didn't want anything Britain had to sell. The Chinese refused British goods, dismissed British textiles, and demanded one thing only: silver. Every year, millions of pounds of silver flowed eastward, draining the British treasury. The empire was bleeding wealth, and its leaders were desperate. Diplomacy failed. Negotiations failed. China didn't want to trade, it wanted payment. So Britain turned to the one thing that could reverse the flow, something addictive, profitable, and easy to grow under colonial control: opium. The logic was brutal but elegant. Grow poppies in India, process the opium under British supervision, and smuggle it into China. Millions of Chinese citizens would become addicts. Silver would flow back to the empire, and the balance sheets would stabilize. It was economic alchemy, turning human misery into imperial profit. By the 1830s, British India had become a vast narcotics plantation. Entire provinces were covered in poppy fields. The East India Company, Britain's corporate arm, managed the operation with the precision of a modern conglomerate. It licensed farmers, processed the drug in government factories, packed it into wooden chests, and auctioned it to merchants who shipped it to China. The trade wasn't secret. It was celebrated. Opium accounted for more than 10% of British India's total revenue. Roads, schools, and military salaries were paid with drug money. When David Sassoon arrived in Bombay in 1832, he saw the system for what it really was: a criminal enterprise protected by law. A man of intelligence, connections, and impeccable timing, he understood that fortune wasn't made by following the rules, but by positioning oneself between morality and power. The Sassoons had three advantages that no one else did: a vast network of merchants across the Middle East, an understanding of how to manipulate colonial politics, and a willingness to do what others feared. Most traders bought opium at auction and sold it to smugglers. The Sassoons built an empire. They financed cultivation, owned the warehouses, ran their own shipping fleets, and even created insurance companies to protect their cargo. They didn't participate in the trade, they controlled it. And because they operated under the British flag, they enjoyed legal immunity. To understand how extraordinary this was, you have to imagine the British Empire at the time. It wasn't just a government, it was a global corporation with its own army, navy, and currency. The line between state and company had vanished. The Sassoons became its perfect partners, independent enough to handle the dirty work, respectable enough to dine with governors. While silver poured back into British vaults, China began to collapse. Addiction spread through every layer of society. Families disintegrated. Farmers abandoned their fields. Laborers smoked themselves into oblivion. But for the empire and for the Sassoons, the suffering of millions was just a line item in the ledger, a sign of success. By the mid-1830s, the Sassoon firm was shipping tens of thousands of opium chests each year. Millions of pounds of narcotics entering Chinese ports under the nose of a desperate government. And still, the British Parliament looked away. The profits were too vast. The justifications too convenient. It is trade, officials said. It is civilization. But deep inside the chaos, a contradiction was forming, the same one that haunts every empire built on exploitation. How long can a system profit from destruction before it destroys itself? The answer would come soon enough, in the form of a man named Lin Zexu, a Chinese official who would stand before the British Empire and ask the simplest, most devastating question imaginable. If you know this poison destroys lives, why do you sell it to us, while forbidding it to your own people? The empire had no moral answer. It had only gunboats. The story of the Sassoon family unfolds like a tragedy written in gold and smoke. It begins with ambition, rises through conquest, and ends in the quiet decay of respectability. When David Sassoon arrived in Bombay, he had nothing but the remnants of his fortune and a network of merchants who still trusted his name. In Baghdad, his father had served as treasurer to the Ottoman governor, an education in power, corruption, and the delicate art of survival. That experience would prove invaluable in the British Raj. David understood something most men didn't, that empire is not about flags or borders. It is about the flow of money and who controls it. He built his first warehouse near the Bombay docks, a modest structure in the shadow of East India Company ships. From there, he began to weave a web, financing local poppy growers, purchasing raw opium at government auctions, and cultivating relationships with British officials who could open doors. Within a few years, he wasn't just another trader. He was the broker of Bombay's most lucrative secret, that the future of empire was addiction. By 1836, the Sassoon family was shipping 30,000 chests of opium to China every year. Each chest weighed over 100 pounds. Do the math, that's more than 3 million pounds of refined narcotics crossing the South China Sea annually. Entire fleets carried Sassoon cargo, their hulls filled with the pale bricks of a substance that would hollow out an empire. The profits were staggering, and they grew with every voyage. The Sassoons weren't smugglers in the shadows. They were men of society. David funded schools for Jewish children, paid for libraries, and hosted lavish dinners for British officers. He positioned himself as a loyal servant of the empire, useful, generous, indispensable, and the British loved him for it. To them, he was proof that commerce could civilize. To China, he was the face of ruin. By the late 1830s, the damage was undeniable. Reports reached Beijing describing cities where half the adult male population was addicted, where soldiers could no longer march, and farmers no longer tilled the fields. Silver reserves that had once flowed into China for tea now poured back out through the ports of Canton. The emperor's advisors called it what it was, a national disaster engineered by foreigners. In 1839, the imperial court appointed Lin Zexu, a scholar and statesman known for his incorruptibility, to end the trade. When Lin arrived in Canton, he did what no one else dared to do. He enforced the law. He surrounded foreign warehouses, confiscated every chest of opium he could find, more than 1,400 tons, and ordered it destroyed. Mixed with lime and salt, the narcotics were dumped into the sea in a public ceremony meant to cleanse the nation's shame. Then Lin wrote to Queen Victoria herself, pleading for morality. How, he asked, can you forbid opium in your own country and yet flood ours with it? If it is a poison to your people, why is it a product for ours? It was a letter meant for conscience, but it reached a treasury. The British government didn't answer with words. It answered with warships. In 1840, the Opium War began. 16 British steam-powered gunboats faced a Chinese navy built for another century. It wasn't a war, it was an execution. British shells tore through coastal defenses, ports were blockaded, and Chinese cities burned. After 2 years of humiliation, China surrendered. The Treaty of Nanking forced it to pay 21 million silver dollars for the destroyed opium, open 5 ports to British trade, and cede Hong Kong in perpetuity. The treaty never mentioned opium by name. It didn't have to. The floodgates were open, and the Sassoons, who had financed British logistics, supplied ships, and provided intelligence during the conflict, were rewarded. They gained privileged access to the new treaty ports and expanded their empire. In the following decade, their shipments soared to 50,000 chests a year, over 7 million pounds of opium entering China annually. The consequences were catastrophic. Addiction became endemic. In coastal cities, men spent their wages in opium dens while their families starved. Productivity collapsed. Local governments, deprived of tax revenue, borrowed from foreign banks, many of them backed by the Sassoons. It was the first modern narcotic economy, a system in which despair generated dividends. But China did not surrender quietly. By the 1850s, new officials tried once more to enforce anti-opium laws in the treaty ports. British merchants cried foul, claiming violation of trade rights. This time, France joined Britain in retaliation. The Second Opium War began in 1856, and once again the Chinese stood little chance. British and French troops marched inland, capturing Canton and then Beijing. When they reached the Emperor's Summer Palace, an architectural masterpiece of gold and jade, they looted it, burned it, and left it in ashes. The destruction was deliberate. A message carved in flame that resistance was futile. The Treaty of Tientsin that followed in 1860 did what the first treaty only implied. It legalized the opium trade outright. For the first time, addiction was not merely tolerated, it was sanctioned by law. The Sassoon family no longer needed intermediaries or smugglers' networks. Their business was official, clean, and unstoppable. With the ink on the treaty barely dry, David Sassoon expanded into new ventures. The opium wealth financed textile mills, banks, and shipping companies. In Bombay, he built the David Sassoon Library, the Sassoon Dock, and several schools. In London, his son Albert, who adopted an English name and manner, was knighted by Queen Victoria and later granted the freedom of the City of London, an honor even the Rothschilds hadn't yet received. By the late 19th century, the Sassoons had become the Rothschilds of the East. Their empire spanned from India to Hong Kong, from Shanghai to London. They controlled trade routes, financed infrastructure, and became patrons of art and education. The opium money had been fully laundered into legitimacy, but every fortune built on dependency carries its own curse. In the 20th century, the world that had made the Sassoons powerful began to disappear. The British Empire weakened. The First World War disrupted trade. By the 1930s, the family's direct control over their companies faded, replaced by hired managers and bureaucrats. The opium trade was long gone, but its ghosts remained, in buildings, in foundations, in reputations scrubbed clean by time. Then came 1949. When the Communist Party seized power in China, it nationalized all foreign assets. Everything the Sassoons owned in Shanghai, banks, real estate, businesses, was confiscated overnight. The family fled to the Bahamas, their Asian empire erased by the same country they had once addicted. The irony was merciless. The nation that had been enslaved by their trade was now the one to cast them out. The Sassoon Empire dissolved quietly. The company limped along in Britain for a few more decades before collapsing under mismanagement. By the 1980s, the British government officially declared its remaining directors unfit to serve. A dynasty that had once shaped the global economy of addiction ended not with rebellion or revenge, but with bureaucracy. And yet, their monuments endure. Tourists still visit the Sassoon Library in Mumbai, the docks that bear their name, the institutions they endowed. Few ask where the money came from. Fewer still know. History polished the name, erased the victims, and left behind only the architecture of respectability. The pattern was complete: profit, moral collapse, redemption through philanthropy, and eventual disappearance. But disappearance is not the same as extinction. Every empire of addiction leaves behind its blueprint, and someone always finds it. The next century would see it reborn under fluorescent lights in sterile laboratories, in pill bottles and prescription pads. The Sassoons were gone, but their business model survived. The product changed. The empire did not. What the Sassoons built was more than a fortune. It was a formula, a pattern so effective, so adaptable that it would outlive the empire that created it. You can trace it across centuries through different products and faces, but the logic never changes. The names change, the substances change, the mechanism stays the same. It begins with crisis. Every empire, every market economy eventually faces a shortage of money, of resources, of something it cannot live without. In the 1800s, Britain's crisis was silver. The country was addicted to Chinese tea, but China refused to buy anything in return. So the empire found a loophole. If you can't sell products people want, sell them what they can't stop wanting. That is stage one, the moral loophole. The point where necessity becomes justification. It's not about evil, it's about math. Profit margins do not have conscience. Once that line is crossed, the rest follows with mechanical precision. Stage 2 is industrialization. The Sassoons didn't invent opium, just as modern corporations didn't invent opioids or cigarettes or social media dopamine loops. What they did was scale it, transform addiction from a vice into an industry. They turned a plant into a product, a habit into a market, and human weakness into an economic engine. In India, the fields bloomed with poppies. In China, the dens filled with smoke. Today, the same principle operates in labs and algorithms: manufacture dependency, manage dosage, optimize profit. Stage 3 is legal protection. The Sassoons thrived not because they broke laws, but because they operated under them. The British Empire needed revenue, and opium provided it. The trade wasn't hidden, it was bureaucratized. Farmers were licensed, auctions were supervised, ships sailed under royal charter. Crime, once given paperwork, becomes policy. In the modern world, the same mechanism takes the form of patents, lobbying, and government contracts. The face of corruption is paperwork stamped with approval. Stage 4 is philanthropy, what the modern world calls corporate responsibility. Once enough lives have been destroyed and enough money accumulated, the empire turns to charity. The Sassoons built libraries, docks, schools, and hospitals. They weren't trying to erase their past. They were redefining it. When your name is carved into stone, people stop asking what it cost. This is the most brilliant part of the cycle. Charity doesn't just soften reputation, it buys immunity. When the Sackler family donated to museums and universities, they weren't inspired by generosity. They were reading from the same script. Every dollar given to art or medicine is a shield against accountability. The building becomes the alibi. Stage 5 is collapse or exposure. The system eventually overreaches. The bodies pile too high, the outrage becomes too loud, the truth too visible to ignore. For the Sassoons, it came when the opium epidemic hollowed out China and provoked wars. For the Sacklers, it came when overdose deaths reached 500,000 Americans. The world demands justice, but by then, the money has already moved. The empire pays a fine, declares bankruptcy, and continues under a new name. Collapse becomes a form of renewal. And then comes the final stage, rebirth. The people change, the product evolves, but the pattern resurrects itself. After the opium trade ended, the Sassoon fortune flowed into real estate, banking, and textiles. After the opioid crisis, pharmaceutical conglomerates shifted to antidepressants, ADHD medications, and new painkillers. The drug changes, but dependency remains the commodity. Addiction isn't a moral failure, it's a business model. There's a dark elegance to this design. Each generation believes it has discovered something new, when in truth it is only rehearsing the past. The technology may be modern, the packaging clean, the marketing ethical, but beneath it all lies the same equation: dependency equals profit. The empire doesn't care whether the addiction is chemical, digital, or emotional. It only cares that it repeats. History remembers the empires that conquered land, but forgets the ones that conquered minds. The Sassoons didn't rule with armies, they ruled with appetite. They understood that the most powerful empire is the one people willingly buy into, the one that sells pleasure in doses calibrated to dependency. That is why addiction outlasts revolutions, reforms, and regimes. It's not a crime, it's a cycle of demand and supply written into the structure of civilization. Think of it as a wheel. At the top sits innovation, the creation of something new, exciting, necessary. As it turns, innovation becomes dependence, dependence becomes profit, profit becomes denial, denial becomes collapse, collapse becomes reinvention, and the wheel turns again. The Sassoons built the first wheel. Everyone since has only learned to spin it faster. The most unsettling truth is that the pattern doesn't require villains. It only requires incentives. The merchants who auctioned opium weren't monsters. They were businessmen. The British officials who taxed it weren't sadists. They were bureaucrats balancing budgets. The Sassoons themselves probably believed they were doing what the system demanded. In their world, morality was a luxury, and survival was strategy. That is the essence of the pattern. It doesn't depend on cruelty. It depends on apathy. Empires of addiction thrive not because people are evil, but because they are efficient, because the machinery works, because the suffering is invisible to those who profit from it. The pattern that began with opium has now become a philosophy of global commerce. Every industry that monetizes attention, emotion, or dependency draws from its logic. When you scroll a screen long after you meant to stop, when you crave a pill, a product, or a like, you are participating in a perfected version of the Sassoon system. The narcotic is simply more refined. Addiction industrialized, legitimized, sanctified. That is the cycle. That is the empire. And unless the pattern is broken, every civilization will eventually find its own version of the Opium War, its own reckoning with the cost of dependency. History doesn't just repeat, it migrates. What began with poppy fields in British India has moved into laboratories, courtrooms, and boardrooms. The Sassoons are gone, but the empire of addiction they pioneered thrives in the modern world under a new name, the pharmaceutical industry. At the end of the 20th century, a family in Connecticut rediscovered the formula. The Sacklers, founders of Purdue Pharma, introduced OxyContin to the world, a painkiller so powerful it could erase pain and create dependency in the same swallow. They sold it not as a narcotic, but as a miracle. Doctors were told it was safe. Patients were told it was controlled. Sales reps were told to push harder. Within years, millions of prescriptions were written, millions of lives were altered, and an invisible epidemic began. The marketing was genius. Pain became the disease, not the symptom. Patients were told they had a right to relief. The Sacklers didn't invent addiction. They rebranded it as compassion. The result was the largest wave of narcotic dependency in modern history. Over 500,000 Americans would die from opioid overdoses. Entire towns collapsed. Families disintegrated. And yet, for 2 decades, Purdue Pharma operated with full government approval, its executives honored, its donations celebrated. The echoes of the 19th century are unmistakable. The Sassoons flooded China with opium while British officials looked away. The Sacklers flooded America with opioids while regulators looked away. Both empires were protected by legality, insulated by philanthropy, and driven by the same moral equation. If it's profitable, it must be acceptable. Even when the outrage finally came, it was contained. Purdue Pharma declared bankruptcy in 2019. The Sacklers agreed to pay $4.5 billion in settlements, a number that sounds large until you remember they made nearly $20 billion from the drug. They kept 3/4 of their wealth. The family lost its reputation, but kept its fortune. Just like the Sassoons, they learned that time and charity could launder anything. Museums once named after them quietly removed the Sackler name from their walls, but the buildings still stand, the money still circulates, the formula still works, and the cycle didn't end there. The opioid crisis was not an isolated event, it was a preview. Pharmaceutical giants like Johnson & Johnson, McKesson, and Cardinal Health, the distributors who shipped billions of pills into small towns, all paid fines. None went out of business. None of their executives went to prison. The penalties were absorbed as costs of operation. Addiction, once again, proved to be a sustainable industry. Today, the substances have changed, but the structure hasn't. The next wave of dependency is already here. Stimulants for focus, sedatives for anxiety, antidepressants for sadness, weight loss drugs that promise reinvention in a syringe. The vocabulary changes, treatment, therapy, optimization, but the dynamic remains identical. Dependence is marketed as health. Withdrawal is rebranded as relapse. Every new pill creates a new customer. Every cure is designed to last forever. This is the modern face of the Sassoon playbook, the moral alchemy of turning suffering into profit while appearing to heal it. Governments approve, insurers reimburse, and shareholders celebrate. No one has to burn fields or smuggle cargo anymore. The supply chain is sterile, regulated, and automated. The ethics are outsourced to paperwork. The addiction doesn't even have to be chemical. Social platforms operate on the same principles. Dopamine has replaced opium as the drug of choice. Every scroll, every click, every notification is another dose in a perfectly calibrated system of stimulation and reward. The human nervous system has become the newest colony, its attention mined, its impulses monetized. And as before, there is always a moral defense. The British said they brought civilization. The pharmaceutical giants say they bring relief. The tech companies say they bring connection. But the truth is the same, dependency disguised as progress. The empire adapts because it doesn't need armies or flags anymore. It only needs desire. The opioid epidemic revealed how little has changed. Companies that cause harm pay fines, rebrand, and continue. Regulators issue reports, not arrests. Politicians give speeches, not solutions. And the public, exhausted by outrage, forgets. The Sassoons relied on time to erase their crimes. The modern world has accelerated that process to the speed of a news cycle. Look closely at the institutions we celebrate today, the research centers, the universities, the museums. Their names are different, but their origins are familiar. When a billionaire donates to medicine, to art, to the public good, it's worth asking what made that fortune possible. The Sassoon Library still stands in Mumbai, its stone facade glowing in the sun. Tourists walk its halls, unaware that every brick was paid for by a drug that destroyed millions. That is the lesson the modern world refuses to learn. Progress doesn't erase the pattern, it refines it. The Sassoons built their empire on opium. The Sacklers built theirs on OxyContin. And somewhere, right now, another family is building the next one, funding research, endowing universities, smiling for the cameras, their product already in our bloodstream. History's whispers are getting louder. The empire never ended, it just changed form. Every empire of addiction ends the same way, not with justice, but with amnesia. The Sassoons died wealthy, respected, and knighted. The Sacklers will likely do the same. Their names may fade from museum walls, but their fortunes will live on, reinvested, rebranded, reborn. The cycle completes itself quietly, as if the suffering that fueled it never existed. That is how time works in systems built on exploitation. It buries the bodies and polishes the legacy. The libraries, the hospitals, the foundations, all monuments to generosity, not to guilt. We inherit the architecture of their crimes and call it culture. We walk their corridors of philanthropy and forget the cost of their charity. But history never forgets. It waits. It watches. It whispers. It whispered when the British called opium trade. It whispered when corporations called OxyContin medicine. And it whispers now in every ad promising happiness, every pill promising peace, every platform promising connection. The voice is the same, only the accent has changed. The real question is not whether we will repeat the past, but whether we already are. Because the mechanics of addiction have escaped the bottle and the needle. They now live inside our phones, our habits, our markets, our institutions. The next empire of dependency will not need poppy fields or pill mills. It will grow in data centers, in laboratories, in algorithms that know our weaknesses better than we do. If the Sassoon story teaches anything, it is that progress and corruption often share the same language. The words are comfort, innovation, relief. The meaning is control. History doesn't repeat. It mutates, it learns, it evolves. And unless we learn to recognize the pattern, to hear the whisper beneath the noise, we will mistake the next empire of addiction for another miracle of civilization. So look around. The monuments are already being built. The names that will one day be erased are already being engraved in stone. The question is not who the next Sassoons will be. The question is whether we will see them before it's too late. And if you want to hear it whisper again, subscribe and follow the next empire as it rises and falls.